introduce Miss Julia Grubbs. She is a brewery consultant with Small Batch Standard, originally from Kentucky. You don't sound like you're from Kentucky.
Comes out sometimes.
Every now. Originally from Kentucky, she's about as far from a one-dimensional bean counter as you can get as a professional dancer and CPA living in New York City. Her love for small businesses and the relationships they enable, combined with her uncanny knowledge of numbers, led her to advising the brewery industry, acting as a trusted specialized advisor for the SBS's wide range of clients across the country. Julia has also previously held positions in accounting, tax, and compliance over her 3 years with the agency. You are definitely not a typical CPA. What's that? Anyway, welcome to the CBAO Summit, and with that, I will give you Julia.
Thank you.
You're welcome to use that mic.
We're going to test this mic and see how it is. Okay. I can project. I don't want to ruin my voice, so I might not do that for the whole hour. So welcome to today's session. It's a post-lunch session, so I know we've got some food in us. Let's try not to fall asleep. You know, we are going to be talking into some numbers and diving really deep, but I really just want you to sit back and kind of absorb the mindset shift that I'm asking you to have, right? We will dive into some numbers, definitely, but I want you to just think, you know, what concepts are coming at you and just have an open mind. So I'd really like to start this off with a story. About a year and 3 months ago, maybe 2 months ago, a client came to us and said, hey guys, I need to go out and raise $200,000 to get me through April of next year. And we said, huh? I need to go out and raise $200,000 to get me through April of next year. Summer was great. Q3 was okay. You know, but I know that I'm going to need that money to get me from January to April. And remember, this was back in 2022, late 2022. So we said, okay, what happened to ERC, PPP, right? Any of these funds that were received? It's all gone. I'm going to go out and raise it. We said, okay, but before you do that, we want to see what happened to all that cash came in, right? Where did the cash go? We made all these sales. Why didn't we see any profit from it? And then that gets us into the second part of really how to make money, actually make money, selling your beer in this 2024. Like Amber said, we're trying to get out of 2023 and into 2024. So I want you to put your owner-operator hat on, and we're going to get going. As she said, I am Julia Grubbs. I am a CPA and a brewery consultant with Small Batch Standard, maybe an unconventional bean counter, as she said. Small Batch Standard, we sometimes go by SVS. We are the premier financial agency built to serve the craft industry. So we do that through outsourced accounting, bookkeeping, tax compliance, growth consulting, fractional CFO, all of it. I've been with the company for about almost 4 years now. Like she said, shifted from the accounting to the tax to the consulting side. And really, I'm diving in with people just like yourselves every day, looking at these numbers and seeing how can we get more profit from selling our beer. We work with about 82 breweries across the country, 4 distilleries and a couple cideries. And this is our team. So we're really just, each of these people, what we do really well is we know this industry really well. And so, you know, everyone is able to just, like I said, dive in and figure out how to help you be more strategy focused so that we can handle the finances. So who here remembers 2015? How many of us were in business in 2015? Okay. What we called in 2015 was the big bang of craft beer, right? Customers wanted more, accounts wanted more. And you can see that through the number of breweries that were open in the US. From mid-2012 to mid-2015, the number of breweries open, craft beer breweries, more than doubled, right? Beer was flying off the tap. We didn't have to think that hard about where the cash would come from. It was pretty easy to sell beer and make money, right? And we talked to customers at this time, and they said that bars and restaurants were coming to them, asking for kegs. And so the big bang problems really were producing more, right? And that required more labor, more space, more tanks, but they were generally good problems to have, right? More demand equaled higher pricing. But now, as we're going to get to, with more competition, the higher overhead that you had to add on to produce that much beer doesn't make sense at the lower pricing, right, with that increased competition. So we're going to fast forward to where we are today in 2024, right? We cannot just borrow cash and not know where it went. We had some habits developed that business problems could just be solved by increasing capacity and brewing more beer. A lot of us thought that. Breweries who rode the wave, ended up overbuilding their capacity so that they could produce more and committing to this higher overhead, and that's now weighing them down. Breweries who have opened more recently, right, didn't do that. They didn't ride the wave, but they copied all of those behaviors because they saw them working in the past, right? And there's still a strong belief system that this is the path, right? This is the path to build a brewery. And our new method is a way to, one, break those counterproductive beliefs down, and then two, provide a replacement for what to do in the absence of those practices. So now we can see that we kind of limped along from, late 2018 or end of 2015 to late 2018 to 2019. We call that the plateau. And then where we are today with the financial struggles that we're seeing, we think actually should have happened in 2020. But we had a lifeline. We had cash coming in, right? But now tap rooms have competition, distributors are more selective, and the price of everything besides your beer has skyrocketed. It's harder, it's less fun. I was just talking to some people earlier and they said they have on hand a number of breweries that have closed in the recent past, right? So we're calling this the reckoning. So what do we think the problem is? We think that we're showing up to a 2024 market with a 2015 mindset. Before, you could produce more beer and go out and sell it. But somehow now, producing more beer isn't producing the cash like we thought it would. So breweries everywhere are spinning their wheels, and this hole is getting deeper. And at SBS, we've been obsessed with figuring this out. So we're going to do a little group exercise today and study this company. They didn't do very well in the naming department, I will say, but we'll give them some slack. This is Downtrend Beer Company. So this graph is called a rolling 12, and we like to get this whenever we start working with someone because it just kind of gives a history of where the business has been and then where it is today. Each point on this graph is the average of the previous 12 months, so that helps to smooth out any anomalies, right? Any accounting, say depreciation, things that are only booked depending on how your accounting system is working, right? Or any beer releases, right? So we really want to get that average. So Downtrend started with a small tap room and a dream in 2014. They rode the boom, they signed with the distributor, they opened a larger second location with more production capacity. And they rode that till their success in 2018, and then demand leveled off. And then we all know what happened next. Dun, 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 COVID, right? But demand had started to level off even before that. So if we saw any of your financials, they would probably look a little bit similar, right? That nice high increase, the dip with COVID, and then the Nike swoosh back up. You can look at COGS line, so that's the gray line. And COGS is tracked revenue, but overall it started to creep up, right? And they haven't been able to increase pricing to keep up with that. Now, some of these things are coming back down, right? But we know that still our costs are increasing. And today they're struggling with decreased distribution placement and lower taproom volume, despite an increase in SKUs and seemingly endless attempts at marketing their beer. You can see that red line. That's our G&A line, our general and administrative expenses. And it's been just creeping up over time. And we'll come back to visit that. And they've cut some costs, but they've just been struggling to control it. And then we look at the yellow line, and that's our profit, our EBITDA, our earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, right? Just saying, what are we keeping from the actual operations of our business? So we can see that they were profitable from mid-2016 to about 2020, and they haven't really been able to be profitable since. So we'll come back. So this is their P&L for the last year, right? We want to look at the numbers, but you don't, there's no test. We don't have to memorize it. We laid out the biggest expenses, but we kind of lumped in the majority of other expenses, everything else that it takes to run their business in this category called other. So let's not get hung up on that. And what this shows, right, we've got a negative $23,000 loss for through December of 2023. So it's mediocre, bordering on poor performance. But this combination is actually pretty bad because it's not bad enough to make you make drastic changes, but it's good enough to make you think that any sort of change or staying the course and improving a little bit along the way is going to get you to where you want to go. So now I have a question. So what would you recommend the small batch team do to help them right the ship? Anything? Yeah.
Look at payroll expenses where they can cut hours, anything like that. Do they have the people they need in the right places, working the right hours? Your payroll and your rent seem to be your two biggest.
Okay, great. Yeah.
I'm going to take a guess. You could outsource your bookkeeping and fire your
Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what's in the other bucket, but other was over 1.2 million.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Anything else? All right, those are, yep, go ahead.
Controlling your controllables. So little things like light bills and gas bills and all of those are controllable lines.
Mm-hmm.
And actually identifying what your controllables are and then making needed changes, adjustments. It's an easy first step.
Yeah, awesome.
Go to more beer festivals. Fire your attorney.
All right, so we've asked some of these same questions. We've gotten some of these answers. So here are just a couple options. You could reduce taproom costs, right? That's an option. You could get a canning line and, increase production and decrease unit cost. Does anybody remember when Mobcraft went on Shark Tank? Okay. Basically, the story is that Mobcraft went on Shark Tank. Mr. Wonderful, Kevin O'Leary, he said, I know your business or your industry. I know it really well, and I think it's overbuilt. There's 20 breweries in the city. There's 20 canning lines in the city. And manufacturing wasn't meant to operate in that manner, right? You can't get those economies of scale. So we want to rethink how we purchase and use our capital assets. We could buy a new location, right? Maybe our first location wasn't in the best spot. Could hire a director of sales, move into regional distribution, find new investors to fund the next stage of growth. Or we could launch a new beer, right? Maybe the next beer is going to be our savior. However, if we do nothing different and act on some of those suggestions, we're going to get what we got play out over the past 2 to 5 years. And that got us here, right? Some marginal gains, maybe, right? But nothing really to turn that ship around. So what if the problem wasn't that we didn't have the best product? What if it wasn't that we didn't pick the right location? What if it has nothing to do with how hard we're working, whether we're working hard enough? What if the problem was that we weren't asking the right questions in the first place? Is Downtrend really one business, or is it many businesses that operate under one or two roofs, because now they have 2 locations? two businesses that may or may not share the same characteristics, cost structure, demand, or profit expectations. So at SBS, we're introducing what we're calling the brewery business units. Instead of viewing the brewery as one big business, singular business to try to improve, we need to break down the business into its distinct business units in order to better understand why it's performing the way it is, right? These are the meaningfully different revenue streams and cost structures I was referring to, which when separated, prevent us from, confusing ourselves with this one big blended mix. For example, you wouldn't compare the performance of a restaurant to a gas station, food mart, to a grocery store, right? That's apples and oranges and bananas. But think about your brewery for a second and just how different it is selling out of the tap room versus distribution versus on your website, maybe. It only feels like it belongs together because it's being produced out of the same facility, right? But it's just as different as that restaurant example. So we've got the big three: tap room, distribution, and contract. And then a little honorable mention for DDC because we've seen some customers do it successfully. And we added contract here as well because we're seeing that become a bigger revenue stream for some of our customers. Now, each of these business units, you could break it down further, right? Tap rooms with no food, light food, full kitchens, self-distribution, local distributors, regional distributors, but we're going to keep it a little bit more higher level. So how does it work? First, we're going to separate out the revenue from each business unit and then the barrels produced or sold to produce that revenue. Then we're going to calculate the COGS for each of those, right? So if your books are great, this is hopefully accurately reflected on your P&L, right? We've got distro-specific COGS, taproom-specific COGS, and then maybe any blended or shared COGS as well. How many of you are using a brewery management software? Okay. How many of you know exactly what margins you're getting on beer sent out and distribution? Woof. Woof. Okay, are we also factoring in our overhead and all of our G&A? Okay. So this is the missing step, right? So a lot of us are saying, okay, we know what revenue we're getting from taproom versus distribution. We know about what COGS are for each of those. But we're going to allocate our G&A expenses to each of those, right? So there's different methodologies to do this. So, something that's a little bit more direct, we know exactly taproom supplies. That's going to all go towards the taproom. Sales labor, all in distribution, right? But anything else, we're going to use a percentage of barrels sold. There are other methodologies too, right? We might use revenue or space for when it comes to rent, things like that. So downtrend for this particular period of time, sold 128 barrels in taproom and 257 in distribution. Total of 385. That's about a 1/3 to 2/3 split. So something like taproom supplies, we just said. We're going to place all of that towards the taproom. Pretty easy. When it comes to production labor, right, it takes the same amount of labor to produce 1 barrel of beer, regardless of which channel it's sold in. So we're going to split that out by barrels, and you've got about 11.6 allocated towards the taproom and 23.4 for distribution. So these are a few examples of how we would allocate and split out the business units. So we would apply this method or other methods to every single expense on the P&L and allocate them to each of our business units. And then we're going to actually do something about it, right? We're going to problem solve and go even deeper, right? It's not just looking at the numbers and seeing what's there, but it's actually taking action on it and making future decisions. So let's look at downtrends. So now we've got a percentage down there, that's that same P&L, a negative 0.5% loss, right? Not great, obviously. It's not the only reason we're in business is to make money, but if we do make money, then we can stay in business. So negative 0.5% when we've got it together. Keep that in mind. So we're going to split out their revenue. We've got taproom and distribution. Pretty easy to know exactly how much revenue is going to each one. Then we've got our COGS for the taproom, right? So we've got our direct COGS, then any other COGS may be shared by barrels. And we can stop right here and already know, okay, what we already know is it takes less COGS to produce that amount of revenue, right? We know that our margins are really good there. Then we're going to allocate the rest of those expenses like I talked about. So all advertising is actually going to go to the taproom. We're not going to put any of that towards distribution. We've got a portion of rent, supplies and materials, utilities, and then all the rest. Right? So this is taproom revenue for 2 locations, COGS and expenses, right? And then the payroll, we've got all taproom labor there, right? No sales labor is going to be stressing the taproom. Admin labor, we can split that proportionally per revenue or something like that. That nets us a 19.7% profit. Our benchmark for standalone taprooms is 12 to 18%. So this is a very strong taproom, right? So you could stop right here and notice if we aren't getting that when we're looking at our taproom specifically, then we can dive into each of these categories and see where they're falling on our benchmarks and then address them there. All right, time for distribution. The first thing we see here is that COGS are massive, right? We can stop right here and dive into the COGS. So one customer we did this with, we determined that their bottles were really just costing them too much, and they were really holding too many on hand, right, tying up cash. But we're going to keep going, right? So once again, there's an opportunity to dive in deeper and fix things along the way. And here's where you might think, okay, well, any additional revenue is helpful until you add the remainder of G&A expenses. You've got $1.4 million outside of COGS, right? We allocated 100% of the advertising to taproom to really stress the taproom business, and still we are running at a major loss in distribution. So yeah, negative 31%. Then we can stop here and say, look at our production labor for this volume that's sold in distribution. Are we staffed for our busiest season all year long? Right? Before we had that blended negative 1% loss. It's not good, but not as bad to make you think that you could just tighten a few things up. But if you look at negative 31%, that means you need to take drastic action. And now we can see where the cash is going. It's going to distribution. Now this is great information, but we can't stop here. We see that distro is the issue for this particular customer, but what about distro is the problem? So we need to dive deeper to see. So we're going to look at this on a SKU level. So we're going to place our focus here, take a deeper look to draw some conclusions on how to fix. So here we've identified that the half barrel and the 12-ounce cases are the most popular SKUs for this IPA, I believe it is. So we need to uncover what each of these are doing for us. So 147 half barrel kegs price and 28 12-ounce case cans. So this is where we would use that finished goods cost per batch report or maybe some spreadsheet action to be able to see, okay, what are the actual COGS going into each of these SKUs. But looking at them in this way doesn't really give us a good comparison, right? Instead of looking at the direct pricing and direct costs for each product, we need a common denominator. So we're going to use barrels. So what this tells us right off the bat is that the case of cans can command a much more significant pricing premium than the half barrel kegs, which is what we would expect. Now, just for your reference, we do have a distribution revenue per barrel benchmark of $300 per barrel. That's if you're working with a distributor, $500 or $525 in self-distributing. So that's what you should be targeting. And we actually think that those margins shake out to be the same once you factor in driving, all the logistics associated with it, that the margins actually end up being the same. So based on that metric, we can see that the kegs are a little bit low and that the cans are above the target. With that said, though, we can't really see the full picture until we start looking at costs. So we want to look at the COGS on a per barrel basis as well. Now here we have the same costs for all the ingredients that go into the kegs versus the cans. However, when we get down to packaging is where we start to see a significant difference, right? And that's where kegs are fairly inexpensive and the cans are pretty pricey. And you can also see that we have a little bit more waste coming from cans. And actually, waste and stuff overall is a pretty significant portion of the cost. So we've summarized that to get a gross profit here of $185 for the half barrel kegs and $187 for the 12-ounce case cans. Now it seems like you should be able to scale that up as much as you want, but unfortunately that's not how things work. Because now that red line that we saw just creeping up before from their rolling 12, here's where it's coming into play. So we're going to add a G&A per barrel to this. Then we get an negative earnings of $255 for the half barrel kegs and $253 for our 12-ounce case cans. That's a margin of negative 87% for the half barrel kegs and negative 65% for the 12-ounce case cans. This is the reality. So where do we go from here? I'm not telling you to stop at wholesale. I'm asking you to get honest with your numbers, right? Total net margins we're seeing in distribution are 1 to 5%. So this brewery needs a sizable swing. So let that sink in for a moment. 1 to 5%. And so often we get the question, what barrelage do I need to get to be profitable, right? All the time. However, this problem is not fixed by volume. This problem is exacerbated by volume, right? You can get those economies of scale once you get to that 20,000 barrel mark, right? But below that, you're not really seeing quite the benefits of that. So what would we recommend? We're going to change up our keg strategy, right? The kegs are the biggest issue we can see at the moment, and there are a number of different ways that this brewery could go about it, right? They could raise their prices on their half-barrel kegs, or they could shift production away from kegs, or some combination of both. Basically going to the distributor and saying, right, this when it comes to having those relationships with your distributor and saying, hey, this product is not working for us. And that's the first immediate action that they can take. And then we're going to address the G&A. Is our labor bloated from when we were producing more beer? Is it our utilities and occupancy costs related to rent or other expenses associated with our building? Is it coming from repairs and maintenance, right? Bottom line, what's the issue here? What are we spending our money on? And, you know, it's going to be a deep and difficult journey, but it's definitely necessary. And I know you can't, right? You can't drop $14,000 of rent overnight. That's obviously not going to happen. But this should play into one, long-term decisions, as well as getting this whole G&A per barrel down. And then we're going to analyze the other SKUs, right? So we looked at their highest volume IPA here, just to start. But chances are that there's other SKUs that are performing worse off, right? So how can you focus your distribution portfolio to make sure that it's profitable, right? And sometimes we get the question, you know, do people knowingly send beer at a loss? I can think of one customer who they do have one product they know they send out the door at a negative 2% loss, right? So that's what we would call a loss leader. But they have everything else extremely dialed in so that they know that they can make up that slack, right? So, you know, people also ask, okay, can you use distribution as an advertising expense, right? That's sure, but you have to know that that's what you are doing and how much are you willing to do that on, right? So speaking of analyzing other things, let's go back to the tap room. This tap room's doing great, right? So let's keep doing what's working. And this may not be the case for your company. If you're not at that 12 to 18% mark after this exercise, you may need to look at each individual category and check on your benchmarks there. And then we are going to build on that success, right? If we shift any focus away from distribution, how can we, what opportunities for expansion does it open up on that retail side of the business? Now, yes, it's shocking to see, holy crap, we're losing so much money in what we thought was going to be our biggest moneymaker. But on the flip side of the coin, we actually have a pretty freaking awesome tap room business. And we can continue to do that really, really well. Right? So if your tap room isn't doing that well, we can look at our front of house, of our back of house labor, our food cogs, our merch cogs. What levers can we pull here? And how can we address it? So let's compare. Get a canning line, reducing those taproom costs, moving into regional distribution, and finding new investors. These aren't bad, they're just not the right moves for this company at this point in time. Why? They're too general. We need to go from the surface level where you could get the wrong conclusion and get into a very specific set of we know exactly where the problem is and how to fix it. So we want you to have a specific actionable set of course corrections to get you back on track. So we might not expand into regional. We might actually stop some distribution. We might not get a canning line. We don't want to add any more elements to our expense structure. And then we're going to actually not reduce taproom costs. We're going to double down on the taproom. We don't want to rob that cash cow of its firepower. So we're going to continue to further enable its success. So now what? We really want a set of next steps for you to take back and apply. So what are you going to do? You're going to run a year-to-date P&L. I would probably start with 2023. Then you're going to split out revenue by business unit and then the number of barrels sold to produce that revenue. You're going to find the COGS for each of those. Like I said, hopefully easily on your P&L, or you might have to do some spreadsheet action. And then you're going to allocate all of the other expenses, right? Direct, indirect. If you don't know which one to use, just use percentage of barrels sold. And then you need to take action on it, right? What do you see now that you didn't before? Where are each of your categories falling in terms of percentage of revenue? Right? What benchmarks are you falling short of, and how can we address it, right? Or we can do it for you. Everything you saw me do, we will do for free. I highly recommend you do this. You can go to this website through the end of February, since it's January right now, right? Yeah. Through the end of February, someone from our team will collect some financials, and then we will send back a 2-page report with some conclusions and recommendations, right? No matter what state your financials are in. So everyone who attended can do this. Just go to that website. And yeah, I highly recommend doing it. You might just get some insight before that you didn't have. All right, and that is all. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
So what methodology do you use at small batch to determine what percentage of allocation you take on G&A in those different business units?
So we look at truly, once we get financial, we look at each account separately. So some accounts might be better suited, so something like bank charges, office expenses. We might split that by revenue, right? So taproom is actually pulling in more revenue per barrel, really. So we wouldn't want to split that by percentage of barrels. But we look at each account separately. So something more, but I would say income is one way, percentage of barrels, or direct, or like I said, space might be, we have a calculation for how we would split rent, right? We want tap room over the whole percentage of square footage, but then the production space, a percentage of that will actually still go to the tap room too. Lots of numbers involved, but yeah, different methodologies for every single account.
So it's definitely not one straight line.
Yeah, no, definitely not.
Which is great. When you're thinking about that, and for those folks, that's the majority that have, a tap room and manufacturing within the same facility, part of that is necessitated in order to support the tap room. Even if you weren't doing distro, of course, 100% of the costs would be allocated.
Right.
But if you're doing tap room and you're doing, some level of distribution, there's still that kind of odd, obligation that manufacturing has just to serve the tap room in the first place. Otherwise, we wouldn't be breweries, we'd be bars.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, that's the benefit that you get is producing your own beer. You get it at a lower cost, right, for the tap room. Did you have another question there, or just?
No, just fascinated how you evaluate that, but I'm sure that's why we go to this website. So we'll have a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
What would you say is maybe the most common mistakes people make on discovering what their true profitability is?
Most common mistake. I mean, truly, it ends up being thinking that their bestseller, or it's realizing that their bestseller is actually not as profitable as they think that it is. Yeah, and so they're going out and pushing it, not realizing that they're sending it out the back door at a loss, and maybe a significant loss, right? So that's where you're gonna find, that's where, when you have to shift your strategy and say, okay, what white space can we fill on this space that's actually gonna go out the door at a profit, right? The margins are just so thin there that you have to have it dialed in, right? And if you don't, then you're losing money and you just don't know why. Yeah.
Do you know any tricks to technically cheat the government but not go to jail for it? Really, when do they start noticing your spillage?
Oh, I do not represent the TTB or any state. No, I want to remember I'm a CPA. There's an ethical component to being a CPA as well.
Yeah, I'm ethical too.
That's where just good data, having good data helps, right? And comes into your financials as well. Yeah.
That was a really, really nice case study, breaking it down into two different business units. And I think one gut reaction to this might be, well, let's just stop distributing entirely and just stick to our tap room.
Totally.
But then you've lost a lot of your efficiencies through volume, and all of your G&A gets moved over to the other business
Right.
unit.
Right.
Did you, by any chance, when you did this analysis, just drop distribution out entirely and just project what would happen if that case study had gone to tap room only?
Yeah, we kind of do that, and we kind of sometimes change allocations. When we talk to customers, we'll say, okay, this account is actually all distribution instead and not that. And so it kind of is that constant shifting. But what we do know is that the tap room actually has the profitability to take on a lot of that stress, right? That's what, the one example was the advertising, whether that's a huge expense or not, maybe not. But it has the ability to do so. And so yes, it maybe it's at a lower loss, but you're also gonna lose some of those other costs, right? If you were to stop distribution. And we're not saying, once again, that you can afford to drop all that overhead overnight, right? That's not the point of that. It's really to just think, okay, what long-term decisions am I making? Am I committing to all that overhead? That was such a interesting take for me when we were looking at, that growth of craft breweries through this is way back here. But to really just see that, oh yeah, everyone just wanted to produce more, so they just took on all this overhead without realizing that, okay, what happens if production actually goes down, and we actually have to keep those expenses. Da, 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 da. It might actually be, wow, there's a lot more slides than I thought. Yeah, right there. Yeah, it's really just, I mean, the number of breweries that opened and everyone just decided, okay, we'll just add more, we'll produce more. That was that big bang, and we just had that demand, and we just don't have the demand as much anymore. So increasing that overhead without having the demand, you know, somebody said earlier, is the market, the demand in that market actually there, right? Before pressing into that market, do you know that it's there? Are you listening to your customers? Are you listening to what they want and not just producing, right? I don't know if that really answered your question, but yeah.
So if you were to, say, cut distribution totally, how are you to know what the long-term effect are? Do you have any sort of research on this long-term effects that would have on a tap if it's your sole business? Because distribution is going to be the biggest advertiser you have, even if it's just a new product, new SKU. So it could, in theory, you could save a lot of money, or you're accepting that loss leader, that you may actually realize, well, how much are you saving on marketing and breaking even on distribution?
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think one thing you have to know is just, if you are thinking of it as a marketing expense, how much is it actually doing for you? How much, right? So sometimes we think of distribution as drawing people to the tap room. Is that how it's actually happening? Are people coming?
That was my question is, have you had anybody that has made shifts like that or cut distribution drastically or just cut it out altogether and looked over 3 or 4 years and seen?
Yeah, I wouldn't say entirely that I can think of off the top of my head. I'm sure it's happening. And that's not necessarily what, maybe you are still in distribution specifically, but it's more working to get to that 1 to 5% margin in distribution, right? Instead of going from that negative 31%, how can we at least get to 0 or 1, right? And even though it's not going to get the same margins that it's going to get in taproom. So no, I think we're watching that play out right now, because it's in 2020 to 2022 is really when everyone was operating without really using the business fundamentals because we had all that money coming in. And so now we're being forced to look at the writing on the wall and make those decisions. And so I don't think people have fully made any shifts yet to see that long-term effect. Yeah? Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so in the example, and just sticking to that, the distribution costs of that IPA were weren't causing losses. And you said, looking at other SKUs in their line might be causing losses as well. With your clients, and I mean, just speaking in broad strokes, what would be the first steps in an action plan towards fixing your distribution? Like, if you're looking, are you looking at what beer styles to maybe push more? Are you looking just specifically at manufacturing costs, or your G&A costs?
Yeah.
Are you what's the first steps towards getting yourself out of that?
Yeah. Well, so we have benchmarks for each category, and so basically we would start on. I would probably say start on the whole distribution side and see where's sales labor falling in the benchmark, where's production labor for that amount of barrels falling, where is overhead, rent, and utilities falling, where are COGS falling on a whole as that distribution business unit, and then make an action plan for those things, and then dive into the SKUs, right? So it's I would say 1A would be doing that, and then 1B would be also look at the SKUs right away. What do we know for sure is not working, and we should not be sending it out the door in distribution? Cut that immediately, right? Because you can stop the bleeding that way, whereas some of those other things might take a little bit longer to fix, right? But so you're gonna wanna look at the SKUs and say, okay, what are our gross margins for this specific SKU, and then what's our highest one? Should we actually be pushing that more? Can we get the volume on that one? All those kind of questions then come up, and we'd kind of discuss that with people. Yeah.
So then my follow-up would be, are there any resources or methods that you would recommend? So your methodology so far has been to analyze your internal data and look at where you're losing the most and addressing those first, and then looking where you're making the most and addressing those second. Outside data, what resources are you guys using or recommending? Right now, we're speaking hypothetical. Like, we have our data, but what data would you guys recommend?
Yeah, so check out our website. We've got a lot of free content and on our newsletter as well. And I'm sure our benchmarks are out there that say, because basically we get the data from working with 80 different clients, right? All across the country in a lot of different markets. So check that out for just specific benchmark data, I would say. As far as what other data you're looking for, I mean, craft beer, the U.S. Craft Beer Association, has the broader trend data, and that's helpful. But you also have to know what's going on in your market too. So I would say take that with a little bit of a grain of salt too, and listening to your customers in your market, and then just making sure that it's all falling in our recommended benchmarks for, say, those bigger categories. Does that help a little? Yeah.
Diving into the P&L is great to figure out where you're making money and where you're losing money, but P&L is only half the story when it comes to your company's books. Because if your balance sheet looks like crap, it doesn't matter how good your P&L is.
Totally.
If you don't have cash flow.
Yeah.
So maybe can you just talk to that for a second, or just you can have a really good looking P&L, but just because you have a positive number at the bottom doesn't mean you're actually having good cash flow, because the P&L doesn't take into account debt payments or
Totally.
interest in that.
Yeah, so we'll do some cash flow projections for people as well. And there's some other benchmarks that aren't on here that compare debt to assets, cash to expenses, all of those kinds of ratios that we pay attention to as well, and they're just not defined here. But yeah, I mean, we recommend at least having 2.5 months of general and administrative expenses in cash. So that way, if cash is not coming in, then you can cover those expenses that are already going to happen. And it takes time to build up to that. It's definitely, what are the 5 numbers that you look at on a weekly basis? Maybe cash flow is really one of them for you, and you need to know every Monday how much cash is leaving this week and how much cash is coming in. How can we delay our AP a little bit? How can we bring up our AR a little bit? What accounts aren't paying? Let's start looking at, right? So there's all these kind of levers that you can pull to help those numbers, right? But those definitely are important too. Yeah?
Just out of curiosity, I'm guessing that the example you built with production being kind of weight on this company is probably for a reason. Would you say that production or distribution costs are the biggest loss sectors that you've seen in your clients?
Definitely. Yeah. And, like I said, tap room benchmark 12 to 18% for net operating income, so earnings. Distribution is only 1 to 5, just because we already know that they're taking that cut right off the top, right? So your margins are just thinner. And so everything else has to be super dialed in so that you can get that 1 and 5%. Yeah, and that's just the way that business works, Any other questions? I'll stay up here for a little bit. I might ask some people some questions on just how you've found the summit today. So feel free to come up and talk to me, and I've got a business card up here as well. And then if anybody else need that link, I can put it back up. We'll go really fast. All right, so there it is. It'll be up through the end of February. Feel free to email me. Thanks so much.